Welcome to the session on critical studies. Today we look into postmodernism, and this lecture is an introduction to postmodernism. I have included the main points only. You need to read more on the terms mentioned here, critics whose postulates and statements are taken here to get a broader overview on postmodernism, because since it is theory, nobody can teach you theory as such. You need to read more and more and understand it by yourself. So I have just discussed the main points and postulates here. You need to go through a thorough reading after you have listened to this video, especially note down all the terms and all the critics I am mentioning. All these are there in your syllabus, describe that descriptive part. So you need to look into all these terms in detail. I will be taking that in class, that is there, but still you need to look into all these things in detail. Okay, we will be, so I have planned it like this. We'll define postmodernism first, then we'll look into the precursors of postmodernism and the evolution of postmodernism, beginning, then evolution of postmodernism and the major proponents, then major tenets, characteristics of postmodernism have been discussed, and critiques of postmodernism. Since you have to study a critique of postmodernism by Habermas, that we'll be dealing with later. So this is the general outlook of the lecture I'm going to take. So the term postmodernism. Postmodernism is different to different disciplines. Some of the disciplines applying postmodernism include architecture, art, history, anthropology, literature, cultural studies, economics, history, management, marketing, media studies, philosophy, political science, sociology, theology, women's studies, and many more. So in all these fields, postmodernism has made an impact. So, and also this postmodernism is different to these different disciplines. Okay, you will come across all these things when you read more and more on theory. The term postmodernism first entered the philosophical lexicon in 1979 with the publication of The Postmodern Condition by Jean-François Lyotard. It is characterized by broad skepticism, subjectivism, a general suspicion of reason, and an acute sensitivity to the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power. So, due to the multiplicity of its concepts and its implications from critique to another, all these and also this is a bit complex to understand, because the term postmodernism itself holds the concept of multiple meanings, and we have different definitions. Like one of the dictionaries, especially the dictionary.com 2016 has defined the term like this: a number of trends or movements in the arts and literature developing in the 1970s in reaction to or a rejection of the dogma, principles, or practices of established modernism, especially a movement in architecture and the decorative arts running counter to the practice and influence of the international style, and encouraging the use of elements from the historical vernacular styles and often playful illusion, decoration, and complexity. So this is how dictionary.com has defined this term in 2016. Okay, and focus on each and every term that I have used in that particular definition, because you need to read a lot about all these terms that are being described in the definition, and then only you'll get an idea of what postmodernism it is. And also our famous Merriam-Webster dictionary has defined postmodernism as relating to or being any of various movements in reaction to modernism that are typically characterized by a return to traditional materials and forms as in architecture, or by ironic self-reference and absurdity as in literature. So this is the definition there. You might be coming across this term self-reference, self-reflection, absurdity, everything in across the postmodernism when you read more and more about it. Okay, so it is considered as, it can be described as a set of critical, strategic, and rhetorical practices employing concepts such as difference, repetition, the trace, the simulacrum. The trace, the word trace you are familiar with when you have studied the deconstruction in the last semester, I guess. Then the simulacrum, that is a new term that we will be discussing in the coming lectures. And hyperreality, to destabilize other concepts such as presence, identity, historical progress, so epistemic certainty, and the plurality of meaning. And all these terms, especially hyperreality and simulacrum, you are going to learn in detail, because these are the basic terms that comes in when you define postmodernism. Okay, so now we'll look into certain traits of postmodernism, especially all those basic tenets of postmodernism. You need to know deep um, about each and every term that I have mentioned here. Then only you will be going to understand postmodernism in detail. And don't think that only these are the terms coming under the postmodernism. There are many other things like metafiction, historiographic metafiction, then magical realism, and many other stuff that I haven't mentioned here that you need to read and find out. Okay, now we look into the basic tenets or the traits: hyperreality, fragmentation, paradox, temporal distortion, anti-foundationalism, pastiche, pluralism, decentering, difference, multiple voices, paradoxes, use of paradoxes, that is what I have given as paradoxical, that is the nature, by nature it is paradoxical. Then self-reflexivity, multiculturalism, non-linear narrative, absence, simulacrum, irony and parody, metonymy, intertextuality, etc. So as I mentioned, we need to look into each and every term that is mentioned here. Then only you will get a proper understanding of the theoretical part of postmodernism. Okay, now we look into the precursors to postmodernism. Often you might be familiar with some of the names, especially you have learned some of them in the last semester. Many of the later post-structuralist and postmodern theorists followed Derrida in concluding that through going deconstruction of modern philosophy and literature, and a radically new philosophical practice will be needed. Then the group of people who engaged in these kind of thoughts are considered as the precursors to postmodernism. Postmodernism can be read as a continuation or the parallel movement that happened along with post-structuralism. Of course, you have already learned post-structuralism and deconstruction. This post-structuralism and deconstruction happens parallelly to this movement called postmodern. So you need to connect all these things in order to get proper understanding. So these are the famous precursors to postmodernism: Soren Kierkegaard, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger, Ludwig Wittgenstein, William James, John Dewey, Georges Bataille, and Antonin Artaud. So these are the precursors to postmodernism. If you are unfamiliar with any of the names, please do look into their contributions, what they have done and all. So I'll just mention a few important stuff. For example, what's Kierkegaard's contribution? He has described modern society as a network of relations in which individuals are leveled into an abstract phantom known as the public. The modern public, in contrast to ancient and medieval communities, is a creation of the press. That is, as I mentioned earlier, postmodernism happened in all disciplines. It actually in media studies also has a major role in it. So the modern public is a creation of the press. The similar elements we'll be dealing with when you learn this term simulacra and simulacrum in detail, which is the only instrument, the press, which is the only instrument capable of holding together the mass of unreal individuals. So this concept of real, unreal, hyperreal, all these things you are going to learn, but please try to read more and more. This is not going to get complete with one lecture or two lecture or three lectures. In this sense, society has become a realization of abstract thought held together by an artificial and all-pervasive medium speaking for everyone or for no one. It is like that. Similarly, Marx also shared some kind of similar ideas, because he already focused on commodities, where he focused more on object which actually lose the solidity of their use value and become spectral figures under the aspect of exchange value. Their ghostly nature results from their absorption into a network of social relations where their values fluctuate independently of their corporeal being. All these terms, the corporeal, temporal, are all postmodern terms that you will be frequently dealing with when you read more and more about postmodernism. Then, of course, as you all know, Marx used to analyze everything under this economic status, economic, that is being held as a kind of set mark for him, and he'll read everything from that. And also we have Nietzsche's views, who he actually speaks of being the last breath of a vaporizing reality, and remarks upon the dissolution of the distinction between the real and the apparent world. This distinction between the real and the apparent, this often comes, or this can be considered as the most important element that is being described in the postmodern work. So definitely Nietzsche can be considered as a precursor to postmodernism. Okay, so what is left is neither real nor apparent, but something in between, and this kind of distorted image is being described in the terms like simulacra and not, that we'll be dealing with later. Okay, so the notion of a collapse between the real and the apparent is suggested in Nietzsche's first book, The Birth of Tragedy, and he has described his postmodern concepts of art and representation, and also anticipates postmodernist fascination with the prospect of a revolutionary movement to a new anarchic sense of community. And also he also talked about the genealogical analysis of fundamental concepts, and also he has tried to redefine the metaphysics of the letter I, or the core concept of Western metaphysics, the I. And on Nietzsche's account, the concept of I arises out of a moral imperative to be responsible for our actions. In order to be responsible, we must assume that we are the cause of our actions, and this cause must hold over time, retaining its identity, so that the rewards and punishments are being accepted. So all these things actually comes in these self-reflexive texts, or extreme self-reflexive texts you used to read in postmodernism. Okay. And there are several other criticism that the points made by Nietzsche. You have already learned about these concepts, his concept of historicism, his essay Discipline and Punish, and everything. I guess you have come across when you have read through this modern philosophy. And also the Nietzsche is a common interest between postmodern philosophers and the philosopher Martin Heidegger. Heidegger has done quite a lot of work on the concept of time and all, which plays a major role in this postmodernism. Okay. So now we'll look into the beginning of postmodernism, when it began, and its major proponents. I haven't listed out the major proponents. I am just mentioning them and giving their contribution or their viewpoint. From that you need to read more, and you should try to find more among them. And also I won't be telling that this is a complete list of the proponents. You can't actually list it out like that. You need to read more and find them. Okay, during the late 1960s, various post-humanist and anti-metaphysical discourses emerged under the rubric of post-structuralism. That, of course, you already have learned all those things. And later, this evolved out into postmodern theory. There was an emergence of a new group of philosophers in France who were not actually following the modernist movement as such, and also they were kind of rebellious in nature, these French intellectual circles, but also critical of the very forms of radical philosophy that has given the establishment headaches in the past, primarily Marxism and existentialism, and to several other movements that prevailed, like phenomenology, psychoanalysis, etc., that prevailed during the time of modernism. And who were this emerging new group of philosophers in France we look into? That is Gilles Deleuze, Louis Irigaray, then Lyotard, Derrida, and Foucault. Okay, so these were the most important among them. And of course, Foucault and Lyotard are the most famous people who have actually caused the birth of postmodernism. They all have been schooled by a theoretical movement, structuralism, leveled by linguists Ferdinand de Saussure and Roman Jacobson. Jacobson, of course, you know that he has later turned out to be a post-structuralist and advocated in mid-century by the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. So all these people were schooled as structuralists, but later discards structuralism. So structuralism discards, of course, you know that discards the centrality of the self and focused instead on a this supra-individual structure of language, ritual, and kingship, which it believes make the individual what he or she is. Simply put, it is not the self that creates culture; it is the culture that creates self. That's the postulate of structuralism. But while structuralists have retained the objective scientific methods in their study of cultural science as words, family relations, etc., these new philosophers have rejected anything objective for to them, even the human sciences, and called themselves as cultural constructions. Because of this, they are commonly named as post-structuralists, meaning not that they have rejected but radicalized structuralism. They told that it is not like that. You can't put everything under the structure sign concept. We need to find out the multiple elements, the possibilities of this multiple voices in it. By the 1970s, French theorists were attacking modernist theories rooted in humanism and Enlightenment rationalist discourses. In the late 1970s, three seminal texts brought postmodernism forward as a movement. We look into which are the three texts. Charles Jennex, The Language of Postmodern Architecture. Especially, of course, you know that postmodernism has begun in the field of art and architecture first, especially with the kind of new type of distorted buildings. If you look into the pics, you will find that they are kind of they are in the shape of this distorted buildings. That's considered as a trend then. So this evolution happened first in architecture. Then Lyotard's postmodern condition, I have given the French name also, please look into it. It was published in French in 1979 and translated into English in 1984. Then Richard Rorty's Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature. You won't come across much of into Rorty because he is an American representative of postmodernism. So we won't be having much to deal with him in your syllabus. Lyotard argues that knowledge depends on the tricks of language that is always relevant to specific contexts. What these people have done, we'll look into in detail. Before that, we need to mention few more people or a few more points. Yeah, after this, the publication of these three books, these three, Rorty, Lyotard, and Renek, were actually putting forward this term postmodern again and again, using this term postmodern, and actually are trying to bring it out as a movement. And these are you can see that when you look into the works, these can be seen as the development of post-Heideggerian philosophy or post-Wittgensteinian philosophy. You can see it, read it like that. Okay, so the pioneers of postmodernism also include this people like Nietzsche, Derrida, etc. Even though they are considered as precursors, they played a major role in transforming or bringing in a change called postmodernism into it. Lyotard, as I mentioned, argues that knowledge depends upon the tricks of language, and Derrida is also one of the most important philosophers of postmodernism, where he interested in dismantling the Western culture or Western canon as such. You have already learned about everything about deconstruction in your last semester, and he has criticized Western metaphysics that represents attendance and the language as and voice signifier. He brought in this he broke this concept of center, brought in multiple meanings and stuff, and also he talked about quite a lot of concepts like identity, essence, logos, tag, meaning, phenomenon, system, and whatnot, difference, deference, everything. Then coming to Foucault, Foucault is also considered, Michel Foucault, one of the pioneers of postmodernism, brought in the concept of discourse and power strength, as he believed that the speeches are strongly associated institutions and scientific knowledge, in the sense that knowledge is an era of what constitutes a speech, includes specific rules agreed upon by the community, and also it constitutes the real strength and power. And also you will find more about him in his book The Discourse of Language. Foucault, he has written more about this idea in his book The Discourse of Language. Then Foucault believes that there is a close relationship between knowledge and power, so that the discourse on the old human, its discourse has become in the 19th century about human excellence. Also, one of the other important books by him is Discipline and Punish. It's absolutely about the power system as structured institutions and organizations, how this panoptic surveillance comes across the people. It's developed upon the idea of Jeremy Bentham. You might have learned Jeremy Bentham or associated him with utilitarian theory in your history of English literature classes, I suppose. Okay, so now we look into other proponents. There is Baudrillard, who is the proponent of that simulation, simulacra, and all those stuff we are already been talking about. He describes the implications for a theory and politics of the postmodern society in which radical semiurgy, the constantly accelerating proliferation of science, produces simulations that create new forms of society, culture, experience, and subjectivity. He also brought in terms like floating truth, hyperreality. He also paid more attention to the science fiction, virtual world, this kind of unreal, real stuff, etc. And that you will be learning in detail. And we'll be discuss. And also he main ideas of Baudrillard comes in his work Simulacra and Simulation, which was published in 1994. Okay, that we'll be dealing with in detail. Then he also talked about the concept hyperreality, as I mentioned. Then coming to Lyotard, he describes the postmodern condition that marks the end of grand narratives, because postmodernism actually saw the end of grand narratives, and we have started working on regional small narratives, meta narratives. Okay, that we'll look into when we talk about narratology stuff. Then and hopes of modernity and impossibility of continuing with the totalizing social theories and revolutionary politics of the past. And coming to Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, they proposed developing the schizoanalysis and rhizomatics, which are major terms that you learn in postmodernism, that we need to discuss those things in detail later. Anyway, just be familiarize yourself with the terms, and also please read more on the terms, which maps the repressive territorializations of desire throughout society and everyday life while seeking possible lines of escape. All these terms, please look into it: territorialization, deterritorialization, etc., etc. All these things you can refer Pramod K. Nair's Contemporary Literary Theory textbook, or any book on postmodernism, beginning postmodernism. Okay, then Deleuze, of course, Deleuze was interested in pluralism as well as the difference, and there are other critics like Laclau and Mauve, who actually developed a radical democratic political theories based on post-structuralist epistemology and a critique of modern political theory, including Marxism. So these are actually political theories, but we can't exclude them since they have made major contributions in postmodernist world. Okay, now the critiques of structuralism were articulated in a series of texts, or they have actually put forward a series of texts like Derrida, Foucault, Kristeva and Cora. You need to look into in detail or read more. Lyotard and Ronald Barthes produced an atmosphere of intense theoretical upheaval that helped to form postmodern theory. So these are few people who laid the foundations of postmodernism as a movement. Unlike the structuralists who confine the play of language within closed structures of oppositions, the post-structuralists gave primacy to the signifier over the signified and thereby signal the dynamic productivity of language, the instability of meaning, and a break with conventional representational schemes of meaning. In traditional theories of meaning, signifiers come to rest in the signified of a conscious mind. Okay. The new theories of language and discourse lead to radical critiques of modern philosophy attacking its root assumptions. There were quite, of course, Richard Rorty and all made quite a lot of contributions in this. And also, when you look into the characteristics, these are some of the major proponents we have discussed. When you look into the characteristics of postmodernism, you can see there is, of course, when you look into the characters, first thing you will find is that it is a bit difficult to distinguish postmodernism from modernism, because all the things this especially the self-reflexivity, self-consciousness, parody, irony, fragmentation, everything you see in modernism also. When you learn T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, all these terms, especially this fragmentation, irony, parody, everything is there. Then intertextuality, everything, reference to other text, everything comes there also. So it is a bit difficult for you to distinguish between modernism as well as and postmodernism. So now we look into how, because we can say that it is an extension of modernist experimentation, but however it in a different way. It gives a radical break, and it is a new way of representing the world before us, especially the idea of the hyper real, etc. Brings in kind of new meaning to all these things, starting from the postmodern architecture. When you look into the postmodern architecture, you will find the difference. Even though we use these terms in a similar way, how that distortion happens, you can see from that example. It's entirely different from modernist architecture. So from there you can actually distinguish it in a better way. Okay. And these are some of the major points you can use when you try to distinguish. One is extreme self-reflexivity. In postmodernism, you can see extreme self-reflexive strategies, especially in it defines everything. It takes, when it comes to literature, it takes high art, low art, everything. Even TV shows, everything is being considered as literature. Like, there is no distinction between that. And in postmodern architecture, this effect is achieved by keeping visible internal structure, as I mentioned earlier. And irony and parody, of course, this visual media plays a major role when it comes to postmodernism. And another important point is that it will lose connection with the historical temporality, because postmodern architects, for example, will juxtapose baroque, medieval, and modern elements in the same room or building. In pop culture also you can see this. When the pop culture is being portrayed or picturized, you can see a kind of recycled things in that. When it is being shown in the big screen, you can see the setting in with some sort of this medieval elements, but in a modern way. So there is that historical temporality is being lost. And also, of course, you know that the breaking grand narratives is one of the most important point that comes in the postmodernism, because postmodernists questions the traditional concept of law, religion, subjectivity, nationhood, which appears to distinguish postmodernity, because of course. And also this criticism they'll include in the mass culture, or this pop culture itself, and also tends to play with the traditional concepts of temporality, religion, and subjectivity. And also it includes all those popular issues, even pure issues, gender divisions, everything, and they will try to bring in some sort of literariness or literary text, any form of literary text with that. Okay, now the notion of simulacrum as well as the social constructivism. The notion of simulacrum, as I mentioned, it is we have lost all connection to reality or history, and we are actually looking into we are not only looking into the artificial, it is only a copy of artificial. All these things we will discuss later when it comes with the when you come across a description with the simulacrum. Okay. So, social constructivism means all the social ideas that we are following are being socially constructed. That is the one of the major postulate which you can you can see in when you look into postmodernism. Okay. Now we'll look into the critiques of postmodernism, critiquing postmodernism, because of course what you have to learn in this paper is Habermas. I am not mentioning Habermas' name anywhere since it is there in your syllabus and we'll be dealing with in the coming lectures. You have to learn Habermas' critique of postmodernism. He is not favoring postmodernism, he is for postmodernism. How his criticism works with postmodernism, that you have to deal with. So in order to deal with that, you need to know which critiques are supporting postmodernism and who all are having negative opinions about postmodernism. As I mentioned, this is not a complete list but only just a helping hand to you people. Okay, now the critics like Susan Sontag, Leslie Fielder and Ihab Hassan read postmodernism as an opposition towards the oppressive aspects of modernism and modernity. Okay, these are the people who supported postmodernism. Then the theologian Frederick Fair, in his work Shaping the Future, Resources for the Postmodern World, which was published in 1976, projected postmodernism as an alternative set of values and institutions for a postmodern consciousness and a new age. He saw it as a good thing that comes in the new age. His emphasis was primarily positive and took the form of quasi-religious prophecy and advocacy of religious values to guide the new age. And now coming to the critics like Irving Howe and Harry Levin, they have criticized postmodernism as a whole, a very negative approach towards postmodern culture, which they interpreted in terms of the decline of Enlightenment rationalism, anti-intellectualism and loss of the modernist hope that culture could advance a social change. And also cultural theorists like George Steiner, he is also known as cultural conservativist. So from the name itself you can imagine. So he also attacked this postmodernism, which he claims has rejected and destroyed the foundational assumptions and values of Western society. Okay, so George Steiner is another person who critiqued, who made negative comments on postmodernism. And then comes Daniel Bell. He claims that cultural modernism perpetuates hedonism, a lack of social identification and obedience. The postmodern age, for him, it's a product of all modernist revolts to daily life. Then also it is a kind of a rebellious act. It makes hyper individualist hedonist lifestyle, it projects hedonist lifestyle, etc. So he sees postmodernism as a radical assault on tradition, which is fueled by an aggressive narcissism that is in profound contradiction with the bureaucratic, technocratic and organizational imperatives of the capitalist economy and the democratic polity. Then of course there are other people also who criticized this: Toynbee, Mills, Bell and Steiner, and other Bell and Steiner we have already mentioned. They also saw that Western societies and culture could be in decline, threatened by change and instability, because they feared that change. The ideas that Matthew Arnold has described in his critical essay, where he talks about the purity of culture and high culture stuff. I hope you remember that thing. You can just imagine the ideas of Toynbee and Mills actually equates his ideas. And of course the positive culturalist wing, that is the Sontag, Fielder, Hassan, complemented already with all this with cultural forms, pop culture, avant-gardism. They have written many things in favor of postmodernism, and there is a positive culturalist discourse, and the proliferation of postmodern cultural forms also helped to prepare the way for the reception of the discourse of postmodernism in 1980s. Then both the positive and negative theorists were responding to the developments in contemporary capitalism about its advertising media, and were encouraging the gratification, hedonism and the adoption of new habits, cultural forms and lifestyles. which all these things together later termed as the postmodern trend. Then, of course, some theorists were celebrating the new diversity with affluence, while others were criticizing the decay of traditional values or increased powers of social control. The discourses of the postmodern and are responses to socio-economic developments, we should say, which they sometimes name, and sometimes they won't, they will remain obscure. Okay, so all the discourses on postmodernism are responses to the economic development that happened in the society. Okay, so I guess we'll stop here, and we'll be dealing with the major terms in the next lecture, and after that we'll be going to the essay by Habermas, that is critiquing postmodernism and unfinished modernity and unfinished project, that we'll be dealing with in the coming lectures. So thank you. Read more on postmodernism. Please explore more on the critiques, as I mentioned in the beginning. Then explore more on the literary terms. So stay safe. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.